Well, my normal recording setup is not, well, which is just me using my phone. It's not going to work because my phone isn't working. I wanted to do some typology stuff because my typology material does get a good amount of views, and I'm sure some people are here just for that and not for other things. But it's so hard to approach the subject. I'm sure anybody who has tried to make videos just generally on typology knows there's like a million different angles you could come at this with, or at least 16 different angles you could come at this with. So I'm just going to start with square one rather than labor over which one to pick, and just start with my own type. And I might cut this into two parts. It's definitely going to be longer than I think it's going to be. I want to get the most basic concepts of typology at least on the table. Some of you may know this, some of you may not. This may be a different take for you. You may not be an INTP. I'm going to go and make it technical. I'm not going to explain a lot of things. It's going to assume a certain intermediate level of knowledge. So if you don't understand what any of this alphabet soup is, I'm not going to seek to explain it here. But take a ride with me. Maybe you might learn something. If you don't know if you're an INTP, or you're just curious about INTPs, you might learn something, or you might just learn something about typology itself. INTPs start. So I'm going to start with J because they're thinking dominant, which is a judgment function, and give a basic view of, just from my reading of Jung and my experience, I'm not trying to get really specific here, of the differences between some of these things, because I don't think it's always 100% clear. But there's two kinds of cognition, basically, is the structure. And there's judgment and there's perception, and I'll put up some types or something here. Judgment is your internal sense, not your external sense. So external senses, that's all about perception, but your internal sense, your common sense, that's your judgment. It's your expectation based on your beliefs or your understandings of things, which may be right and may be wrong, and are certainly different between these different types of people who are all judgment-dominant types. It's about priority and equivalence. What is and is not the same as something, what is and is not more important or less important or equally unimportant or equally important, all those kind of notions come from our judgment. It's partial, it's biased, it seeks to optimize things based on values and good outcomes and things like that. It's very decisive compared to perception, but it's also kind of blind to objective realities sometimes, and external realities. Sometimes it's indifferent, sometimes it's contemptuous of those things. We'll talk about, I guess, types of judgment as how I have it disordered first, and then I'll get into perception later. Thinking is what the T stands for, and all this typology stuff. It's kind of judgment. It's the more logical. The more we consider things like logic. Again, we're just giving general sketch outlines. I'm not trying to get into technical details or really pin these things down, and there might be reasons why it's hard to do that. I'll get into that later. But thinking is more concerned with logic and accuracy. It's quantitative. The sense of what is this and is that, and equality of things, those sorts of notions. It depends on if it's internal or externally focused. But those notions that we normally consider with data-driven stuff, facticity, what is and isn't fact, all of those are the concerns of the thinking side of judgment. And those can be contrasted against the feeling side, sometimes called ethics. Thinking is sometimes called logic in socionics. Feeling is sometimes called ethics, which is the personal or humanitarian aspect of judgment. It's a values and qualitative base. So it's more about what's good and what's bad. It's better at really determining those kinds of things, where I find thinking is better at determining what is the same as what. Feeling is better at determining what is better than what. It is a bit more anthropocentric, but at the same time, feeling can have that. Without feeling to contrast thinking as part of our judgment, we would all kind of be a self-destructive, mad scientist sort of society. So I'm just speaking, as a thinking type, we need to realize that at least in terms of typology, thinking and feeling are equivalent. They're both the same. They're not. One's not better than the other. One's not more important than the other. They're both just kinds of judgment. And hopefully that's the big, usually it's described sometimes as head versus heart, but that's kind of poetic. Hopefully some of that quality versus quantity, personal versus logical, or more human-oriented versus more data-oriented, makes that distinction between T and F more clear. On the perception side, we were contrasting that versus judgment and kinds of judgment. Perception is much more experiential. It's your body's impressions and your body's expressions, actual and potential things. So the sort of actual comes from our sensation side, the potential from the intuition. It's generally more objective than judgment. It has a better view, but it's less decisive. It's kind of like I find that perception dominant types are almost always fighting a sort of automatic agnosticism or a let's wait and see, or it could be this, could be that kind of mentality that I find is not there with judgment types, who are much more comfortable making decisive statements and taking decisive actions. Of course, these are all just general things. And sometimes we associate, I think, things that are actually judgment-based with intuition and sensation. Starting with intuition, this is the abstract, versus the concrete, and the hypothetical, the theoretical, versus the what is now. It's the what could be. It's also very symbolic, and so it can be abstractly symbolic or expressly symbolic. The introverted direction of intuition is much more about the archetypical image and the primitive image and the symbolism in that direction. But I also think a lot of our graphing and our mapping of things are features of intuition and not thinking. Sometimes people think that those things are qualities of thinking, but they're actually qualities of intuition. And I think that's why NF types do pretty well in school, because they're pretty good at the conceptual stuff. They're pretty good at the symbolic stuff, the abstract, the hypothetical. All that's coming from intuition. And it's sometimes, I think, mistaken for thinking judgment when it's actually intuitive perception. Sensation is the actualities of the world, not the potentialities, the practical versus the purely theoretical, the realized versus the could be. And so sensation people are, traditionally seen as more down to earth, less heads in the cloud, head in the clouds, I should say. Maybe they're right, but they tend to see us intuitive dominant as or I'm not intuitive dominant, but intuitive types as like airheaded, scatterbrained. Certainly as an extroverted intuitive type, I'm bit the bill on that one from time to time. But the sensation types, the sensors, are much more concerned with the stuff that you can actually present for real, not the stuff that, in some hypothetical universe might actually be the case. Generally on introversion and extroversion, because I did want to talk about those, but I wanted to talk about separately from J and from P, because they don't work the same way. Introversion and extroversion represent the directions that your functions are oriented, whether your judgment is oriented in that direction or your perception is oriented in that direction, and what side of that judgment or perception you're using. So you can go inward or you can go outward. That's what introversion and extroversion are referring to. And Carl Jung introduced these concepts to psychology. I'm sure some of you know, but some of you may not know. So introversion is the internally referenced, not externally referenced. It's reflection, action, reflection. It's subject-oriented, and it tends to see things better as subjects, which is, some things can be seen as subjects. It's hard to see all things as subjects, as having a sense of experience and a sense of subjectivity. But as far as what is right and what is wrong, the introvert is more likely to, when I say internal reference, I mean ask themselves, is that what I've experienced? Is that what I know? Is that, does that make sense to me? When you look at the extroverts, however, it's going to be externally referenced. It's going to be much more self-doubt, but much more knowing where to go in terms of how do I find out outside of myself what is the truth. And as opposed to the reflection, action, reflection, you've got action, reflection, action. So reflect on the consequences of the action and then act based on that reflection, as opposed to the introvert's reflective process leading to action and then more contemplation. The extrovert is more object-oriented in terms of object-subject relations. So it's objective in that sense, and it's also the perils of that is seeing the self. The extrovert sees themselves sometimes as an object, or other people as objects. They can sort of iron out into two dimensions the sort of rough and textural qualities of a person, and ignore the subjective factor and the importance of the subjective factor, because the world objectivity is just one half of the whole coin. That'll be the first part, I guess. I'll get into the functions of the INTP after that, but hopefully that gives a basic outline. If any of this was unclear or bad or mistaken, or you want to add anything or any color yourself, go ahead and do so below in the comment section. Thank you for watching. Please do like and subscribe, or look around for some of my other typology hangouts and typology videos. I did do one on intuition, the intuition section of Carl Jung's psychological type, so check that one out, and I will talk to you next time I talk to you.